Good morning, everybody. This is Keir Murray. I'm political and public affairs consultant here in Houston. I'm joined by Dr. Richard Murray from the University of Houston, also my father. It is Tuesday, March 31st, 2020, the end of what has been undoubtedly a remarkable month in our national life. As we continue with home confinement in this era of social distancing related to the COVID-19 crisis that the country's in. My dad and I are getting together to discuss the sort of political ramifications of this ongoing crisis. We're not medical or public health experts and don't pretend to be, so you're not going to hear us opining about what we should be doing from a public health standpoint. We'll leave that to the experts, but we do want to talk about the political ramifications of what's going on because they're incredibly important. Think back, just 4 weeks ago today was Super Tuesday. May as well have been 4 years, as much has happened since then. We have a dynamic national situation, and I wanted to start off, Dad, by just kind of getting your take on where we are now several weeks into this crisis with seemingly no end in sight.
On that point, the New York Times this morning reported that the UK, Britain, now thinks that it'll be 6 months before any kind of normality returns, and there's still going to be issues out of this coronavirus. If you project that to the United States, and we're pretty much on the same track of when the infections really got started here as in Europe, that would take us almost to the presidential election itself in November. Wow. So this is going to be a huge ongoing event. We've had a tremendously interesting 4 weeks, but we're looking at months now with the timelines we're seeing emerge.
So in that context, obviously, putting the health concerns aside, from an economic standpoint, this is probably the greatest single shock the U.S. economy has ever experienced. A report from the St. Louis branch of the Federal Reserve yesterday estimated we could see as many as 47 or 48 million job losses, unemployment rate of nearly a third of the workforce in America. What is this going to do to our national economy and national psychology around our economy if this persists, as you say, for several months?
Well, the only thing comparable is probably the Great Depression that started in late 1929 and built to a climax in 1932 and 33, but that unfolded over a 3-year period. This happened in a matter of weeks. Of course, we got an extraordinarily different political world in 220 than we had in 1929, a much larger federal government, economists that know a lot more about how you respond to crises. We're already seeing talk again today in the New York Times about this third big bill with the $2.2 trillion is just the third. There's going to be a fourth and maybe a fifth. Because in this kind of enormous crisis, the private sector can't handle this. There's simply no way, because you get into this downward spiral and people can't pay their co-businesses they work with. So you put an enormous burden on the national government, which is the bank and the only bank that has liquidity. But also it's going to enormously stress the state governments that have to carry out these programs to try to actually get people somewhat whole, pay the rent, subsidize unemployment. And I just don't know if we're up to that. We have a national administration that's not renowned for its management skills. We have a lot of tensions between states and the federal government already, but think if you magnify this economic crisis by 5 or 10 times, those conflicts are going to become much more sharp and difficult to resolve from where I sit.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to as well the sort of interconnectedness of our economy globally with other countries like China. And as we know, in this COVID crisis, no country is immune, and the timelines are different for various countries, but virtually everyone is or is going to be affected in some significant way. Of course, we've seen now, looks like revised numbers out of China that the death toll was much, much higher than they had initially reported. And they may even be looking at a second wave of this illness starting to creep in over there. In that context, I wanted to talk a little bit about the nature of our federal system and how that has framed our approach to this crisis versus a country, for example, like South Korea. I believe the United States and South Korea had their first confirmed cases of COVID-19 on the same day in early February, I want to say. But South Korea has had a much more national, aggressive approach to controlling the spread of the virus. They've had vastly fewer deaths and confirmed cases than the United States has. I think about 5% of the number of deaths that we've had, which are now over 3,000 and more than the number of people who died in 9/11. And we've seen a great variety of responses from various governors and municipalities in the country. You know, for example, Mike DeWine, a conservative governor from a big state, Ohio, has had a very aggressive and proactive response to this crisis, whereas Greg Abbott here in Texas has been much more hands-off, sort of letting the localities proceed the way they want. How do you see that, how our federal system, our 50 states and then various local governments below that, how does that affect our ability as a one country to address what's going on with COVID-19?
Well, given that this illness doesn't respect any boundary, state or county or whatever, you're probably better off with a more centralized model like Korea has, where the national government can very quickly move across the entire country. Of course, Korea is pretty populous, but a very much smaller country. And we have a 250-year tradition of substantial state autonomy that Korea doesn't have. So it's much more difficult to manage it in this country. But the crisis is spreading. Florida is a good example. You had there a conservative governor, like we have here in Texas, that was pretty slow to intervene, but they've had this spike in cases in the last few days, and he's basically recognized we got to have a statewide rule. But he's coming to the table weeks after Washington State, which looks like, to the extent we have a kind of state to model ourselves on, they were the first state, of course, to report cases and the first that had a substantial outbreak starting in the nursing home. But it looks like they are bringing the spread under control. But many other states are nowhere near what happened in Washington State in terms of imposing statewide rules, really clamping down on movement, pressing employers to keep people to work from home. So in some ways that's encouraging, but Washington State is 2% of the country. So we got a lot of other folks that are under very different conditions that it seems to me are pretty far back on the curve, that they're a long way from the peak in their state.
Yeah. And, again, I'm thinking a little bit about this from an economic and a healthcare policy standpoint. Obviously, we're in the early days of this crisis and we don't know how this is going to play out. But I'm wondering, if folks are beginning to think in sort of macro terms about what this is going to mean for the United States in terms of the social safety net, in terms of healthcare coverage for Americans that's largely been tied to employers. We're probably going to see many millions of Americans lose that coverage in the coming months. Obviously that's going to have a big short-term effect, but as a nation, how might we look to address the social safety net, healthcare, those kind of macro issues as a matter of policy, depending on how this plays out?
I think this is an earthquake that is going to have lasting reverberations in our economy and politics. And of course, a lot will depend upon how the election plays out, who controls Congress, who the next president is, we reelect Mr. Trump, or we have a new president. But I like the quote that somebody said a couple of weeks ago: I went to sleep in America and I woke up in Europe. That we're probably going to have to move quite quickly towards something approximating the much more robust European style safety net. Germany, for example, has a system where when people lose their jobs, there's much more of a cushion that the government subsidizes employment. But in addition to doing something on that front, we can't handle 50 million people unemployed. That just is simply going to be unacceptable. But also, as you point out, 50 million people without health care or health insurance. Well, the whole system breaks down if nobody can pay. So you're going to have something, some kind of public option that the government's going to have to deeply subsidize, in my view, depending on how the health crisis plays out. But it looks like it's of sufficient severity and is going to last long enough it's going to force a profound shift in how our health insurance, unemployment insurance, and basically the role of the federal government, which is going to have to step up to the plate.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we'd heard a lot of statistics prior to this about how, close to half the country would have difficulty coming up with $500 in a crisis, relatively low savings for most Americans, some none at all. Uh, just a lack of economic preparedness to weather this kind of a storm. And I'm trying to think about what that, if we just try to go back to normal after this is over with, whenever that is, from an economic standpoint, which I'm sure the sort of, the folks in corporate America, big business want to happen as soon as possible. Things were going pretty well, I think, from their standpoint. And, cosmetically maybe going well for the country as a whole. But underneath that, I think this has revealed what a lot of us have suspected for a long time, which is that there's people are not able to weather this kind of difficulty financially. And as you say, that's not sustainable for a country of 330 million people. What are political leaders, whether it's Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders? Sanders has been pretty consistent about an approach to this, and we'll get to him in a minute when we talk politics. But what are leaders in this country going to begin to say to the American public about how we prepare our society, prepare our populace for these kinds of shocks if we're going to have them in the future, and just have people better with more financial resources to weather these kinds of storms?
I think some of these questions are pretty easy. Like, how did Korea respond so much more effectively? After the SARS epidemic of some years ago, they put in place a national plan of how to deal with the next epidemic. Well, almost for certain, we're going to have to do that. And a real plan with real muscle behind it, that early detection, massive quick intervention, that's pretty easy. We've got that. So that's going to happen. You'd be incredibly stupid to practice malpractice here politically by not preparing for the next epidemic, because in this interconnected world, they're surely coming. But much more difficult to figure out, how do you make the adjustments in your underlying economy, employment patterns, insurance. And if we look back at the Great Depression, you just had a presidential election. A new president had taken office in March 1929, and 6 months later, the bottom started falling out. But it fell out gradually. Ours didn't. Now we're at the other end of this. We're in the fourth year of a president who's been controversial. He certainly has a lot of supporters. He has a lot of detractors. He's very unusual. He has an unusual style and manner. And now he's got the greatest challenge of any president since, I think, at least Franklin Roosevelt in World War II. And we don't know how President Trump's going to handle this, but he's front and center by his own choice. That's where he wishes to be. And he's running for re-election. And so huge consequences for this presidential election, because along the way there, you're going to have to lay out quite different visions of where you go forward. We can't go back to what we had before. So, but which direction do we go? The Republicans will define, their position, which will be whatever President Trump wants, because he controls the party. And the Democrats probably have their nominee, but they don't have their platform yet. And it'd be quite interesting to see, whether it's in Milwaukee or whether it's on a video convention, what the Democratic response is. And they have to be, I think, quite specific, given the magnitude of this crisis it will be facing by July 2020, when the Democrats have to formally settle on their nominee.
Yeah, I find it a bit ironic that, the federal government approved this massive stimulus in the last week, over $2 trillion, as you mentioned, without virtually any dissent from either party. I think one member of the U.S. House who forced everybody to come back and vote. But remembering the context of Obama trying to pass a stimulus in his first year as president, and getting very few members of the Republican Party to go along with him, complained vociferously about, government overreach. And we've just seen something that easily, 3 times that stimulus that's just been passed virtually unanimously. It's an interesting how context changes. You mentioned the Democratic race. I want to talk about Bernie Sanders for a minute. As we know, it's been a couple of weeks now since the last primary contest. Joe Biden is extended a delegate lead that looks like it will be very difficult to lose. Most polling that I've seen in the last few days shows the Democratic race pretty much frozen, with Biden with about a 25-point lead on average over Sanders. We've had some primaries delayed because of the COVID outbreak. But we'll have, I think, contests scheduled in the next few weeks, if I'm not mistaken, in April. We don't know yet whether all those will go forward, but Sanders has indicated he has no plans to get out of the race. I'm curious what you make of that, what you think his ultimate goal is as a candidate, and whether he might potentially have the kind of spoiler effect that a lot of people thought he had in 2016 after being vanquished by Hillary Clinton.
Well, look at, Bernie is 78. He's had a remarkable 4 years late in his life and political career. He was a relatively unknown United States senator in 2015 when he decided to run for president against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic nomination. Flash forward to today, nearly 4.5 years later, he is one of the most famous people in America. He's a major power player. He has one of the most successful grassroots fundraising operation we've ever seen. He's going to be an influence this year. He's not likely to be the Democratic presidential nominee, but he's had remarkable success. And by the way, personally, he's gotten wealthy. And he'll publish another book after this cycle, if he lives on, and make even more money. So there's little incentive for Sanders to get out. He's never been much of a Democrat, so he scores low on the party unity scale. He's not had a bad relationship, particularly with Vice President Biden, unlike his soured relationships with Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. So he's probably going to be somewhat easier in terms of personal attacks. But I think from his perspective, why get out? There's still 40% of the Democratic delegates to be chosen. He will get probably 40% of those minimally because of the way Democrats allocate delegates. So he won't be the nominee at the convention, but he'll have, if it happens, 1,300 delegates. They'll have to be listened to in the platform. This huge unanticipated crisis does give him some more leverage because we are going to have to rethink our healthcare system more quickly than any of us thought would be the case before the 1st of March of this year. So he's going to stay in, stay active, pull the party, particularly on healthcare and unemployment, as far to the left as he can. Probably, in my view, not play an open spoiler role, but how strongly will he urge his supporters to get behind the Democratic nominee? I simply don't know that. Will it be a tepid endorsement or actually, appearing on stage, if we have a stage in this post-virus era, enthusiastically raising the arm of Joe Biden? He wouldn't do that with Clinton. Maybe he'll do it with Biden. But right now he's a free agent.
Yeah. Well, and that sort of leads me to another question, which is, how is this going to work in terms of the convention? Is it going to happen in person, or is it going to be virtual? I know on the Republican side, President Trump has, been very insistent that his convention needs to go forward. But again, in the context of what's going on with this virus, I don't think anybody can take that to the bank. He's shown some propensity to shift his message on other matters related to this as events intervene. But, if we're looking at Joe Biden as the presumptive nominee, he said he's going to pick a woman as a running mate. Who do you think that might be? I have some ideas. And how is this going to work in terms of actually executing the convention?
Well, think about the timing. When you plan these, you expect that you have to avoid the Olympic window. Well, that window's closed, but nobody knew that when they picked the dates for these conventions. The out party, the Democrats that don't hold the presidency, go first. So they have to go before the Olympic break, and that's July. The Republicans go after, so they're in August. So in effect, it's Democrats first. And of course, Republicans don't have too much business. It'll be a coronation of President Trump for re-election. And we still have some real issues on the Democratic side, but less time to resolve those. So just the top of the head guess is we'll either have a severely pared down convention in Milwaukee with relatively small numbers of people other than the delegates themselves, or it'll be all done electronically from a distance. And I just think, the track of the disease will determine that. But we can't have 20 or 30,000 people convening in Milwaukee, including some of the most important people in the United States, and rubbing shoulders close together. We've already got a half dozen members of Congress that have been diagnosed with the virus. And, the Prime Minister of the UK is laid up and apparently not feeling too well. So the political class is really at risk in doing normal things. So I think pretty good chance that the Democrats will stick to the dates they've chosen, but probably have to do this from a distance, which will totally change the modern world of these as being sort of choreographed, made for TV performances, and there won't be much of that, I think.
And
Trump
what about
insists on it for the Republicans because he's got another 5 or 6 weeks, and he's probably more willing to risk something on the health side to put on the show. He is, after all, a superb showman.
right? And on the Democratic side, what about the vice presidential choice? I mean, Biden's already said that he intends to pick a woman to run with. There have been some names floated. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think you can do anything there until the delegate selection is finished, and that's mid-June, roughly. Probably you strategically pick a time to, you've gone through 4 or 5 people that are pretty thoroughly vetted, and that will be known. Obviously, Kamala Harris will be looked at from California, a woman of African-American background. Amy Klobuchar, of course, whose endorsement and delivery of Minnesota, a very important November state, had to impress the Bidens. I don't think Stacey Abrams in this time of crisis measures up to having the background that's needed to be a credible running mate. She's a good futures player for the Democrats. But I think the senators from California and Minnesota are at the top of the list, followed third by the governor of Michigan, again, a female from a vitally important upper Midwestern state that the Democrats must win back if they're going to have a serious shot at the presidency. So those are my top 3. I think 80 to 90% the nominee that Biden picks will be from that short list.
Yeah, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, who I think also has found herself at odds with the president over response to this crisis in recent days, which might move her up the list, frankly.
Yeah, because the governors are on the Democratic side in the spotlight now, and a lot will depend upon what their own performance. The governor of Michigan will be making some news in the next few weeks or months, and that will either enhance or diminish her prospects of being on the ballot.
And so, what we haven't talked much about, and I think we'll wrap up with this, is Donald Trump himself and how his public performance and his policy decisions and other executive decisions so far during this crisis are playing out. I think when we spoke last, we had talked about some increase in polling numbers for him, relatively modest under the circumstances, and a sort of rally around the flag effect. Doesn't seem to be a whole lot more than that so far. How do you think politically this is playing for him and is likely to play out given the severity and potential length of the health and economic crisis that we're in?
Short term, if the election were held next week, he would probably have a slightly better chance of winning than we had at the first day of March. But the election isn't next week, it's in November, and it will almost certainly go off. We held an election in the middle of the Civil War. The Constitution is pretty explicit, and the president doesn't have any role in setting the date. So I think we'll have an election in November. We may be mostly by mail or electronic, but I think it'll go off. I think the crisis long-term will severely hurt the president politically. This is not the most competent governing administration in the history of the Republic. This is an enormous challenge for any president. And he has a weak team, in my view. 5th chief of staff, who's literally not legally chief of staff because he's a member of Congress, and you can't have the president. So weak team, terrible crisis, challenging to even the very best managerially skilled executive. Probably not going to play that well electorally. The president has that unshakable base of 90% support among identified Republicans, and we have to assume that is not going to change. But that's not enough to win. And just about as many Democrats are never going to vote for him. So you got roughly an equal tie in the base, But the people that are in the base, including a lot of young voters, aren't particularly enamored of the president before this crisis. And I'm just reading their reports of what they're doing in my class of 19-year-olds, and they're going to go stir crazy. And they're not probably going to be in much of a mood to reelect anybody. They're probably not going to get their favorite Bernie Sanders, but they're not likely to vote for Trump.
I mean, I guess, so do you ultimately see, I mean, obviously the Democratic nominee, who that is, matters, but how much does that matter really in this election, do we think? Or is this pretty much an up or down on Trump? What we're likely?
The latter. I think Trump is 75% of the equation, and the Democratic candidate, if you're just looking at the personal matchup, is maybe 25%. If it had been Sanders, who's a more volatile, unpredictable candidate, that would have increased the Democratic side of the equation. But with a kind of normal politician that we think of Joe Biden as being, with his flaws and strengths, it's going to be mostly about Trump.
Okay, I've got a question here from Mary Ward. Can you comment on the growing popularity of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and any effect this might have on the Democratic race?
Well, this talk about dropping Biden and switching Cuomo, that's not possible in the way the party rules work. And Cuomo is in part popular because everybody knows he isn't going to be the presidential nominee. He's the governor. That's the terminal job he's got. He's got a terrible challenge in his home state. But he's never been liked much publicly by the liberals or the conservatives in the party. And if there was some actual move afoot to switch him in, that would be fierce resistance from across the spectrum. So he's an interesting player. He's got he's in his third term. He can pretty much he's sort of got control of New York State now to the extent he's ever had before. So he can play this out to protect the interest of his state, but he's not now a national political perspective nominee. Not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think people forget that his approval numbers in New York State weren't great before this crisis, and they've gone way up in the context of his response. I think partially because he's been competent in the way he's approached this, but also he's been sort of the competent sandwich in between what's happening in Washington with the president and what's happening with the mayor of New York City, who I think has received equally low marks from most people for his handling of this crisis in New York City. Question from Bruce Nichols. Dick, can you talk a little bit about whether mail ballot voting will be adopted and how that might work?
For sure, in many states, less likely in Texas beyond some expansion of what we have already, which is it's available if you're 65 or older. We'll certainly keep that and probably expand it. But the Republican establishment in Texas is not interested in encouraging another 2 or 3 million people to vote in 2020. And if you mailed everybody a ballot, the way you do in Colorado and Oregon, that would likely be the effect. So I think here Governor Abbott and the Republicans who control the legislature are not going to A, call a special session, and B, put in vote by mail for all Texans. But in many states, that's going to be the case.
Yeah, I thought I read an interesting comment from Trump yesterday about mail ballot voting. It's effectively admitting if you let more people vote, you'd never get another Republican elected again. So you might be right about Greg Abbott and Dan Patrick and the Texas crowd not having much interest in expanding that. We'll see. But I think, I mean, as you say, but it seems quite possible that we're going to have to make some kind of dispensation for people. I think if this is dragging on into October, a lot of people they're not going to be comfortable physically going to a polling place. And, if you try to do this social distancing and keep people apart, it would just hugely increase the amount of time. And we had problems with lines in Texas in various locales during the primary, and those would just be exponentially worse, I think, under these kind of circumstances. So it seems to me that, I don't know what the answer is, and they won't certainly ask me, but some kind of accommodation is going to likely have to be made for folks.
Yeah, you can get a ballot now, but you have to have an excuse to get it if you're less than 65. But I think you may have to interpret the rule that concern about this virus is a legitimate excuse. But what we're not going to do in Texas is that the government here is not going to proactively send you the ballot. What they may allow is for you to request the ballot, but you are individually are going to have to take the initiative, and that produces a far smaller level of participation than if everybody's getting the ballot mailed automatically. I think we'll also have to consider things like drop boxes instead of everything going through the mail. That we may have to have 100 of these drop boxes that are effectively early vote mail stations where you go and it's simply dedicated to collecting these ballots.
Yeah, and Bruce just had a follow up about how would these kind of ballots be verified? I mean, my assumption would be they would be verified in the way that mail ballots that come in are now, which is at the county level. They're counted, and there's a ballot board that's usually equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, where they look at all of these ballots, make sure the signatures match, that kind of thing, accept the ones that look good and throw out the ones that look shady.
That's a good question, because one of the things it's certainly going to happen nationally is there's going to be many more mail ballots in November 2020 than in 2016. It's going to take a long time to count them. So one of the things in California is you're 4 or 5 weeks after the election before the Secretary of State can certify the result. And I think we're going to have a whole bunch of states that instead of, Florida goes for Bush at, midnight, hell, we're not going to know. So it's going to be, in many instances, if this election is not a blowout, if it's a landslide, well, you figure that out pretty fast. But let's assume it's reasonably close again. I think we're just going to have a bunch of states that will be impossible to call because of the volume of mail ballots that cannot be quickly tabulated. So all kinds of changes are happening in our political culture, like the inability to campaign traditionally. But the ballot counting is going to be substantially different, substantially slower. And we may be, for different reasons than in 2000 with Bush Gore in Florida, we may still be in December, not sure yet what the electoral vote is.
And that potentially has profound consequences for confidence in government and, among other things, continuity of leadership, that kind of thing. Okay, well, we're at about the half-hour mark, which I think is probably a good place to wrap up. Just a note to folks, we're going to try to do this once a week. We're looking at Monday mornings around 10 o'clock or so, but that, people strongly object to that, they can let us know. But we'll post this video online as well for people to access. And Dad, social distancing once again from 8 blocks away. See you soon, and hope everyone stays well and healthy and psychologically, on sunny side up. Bye-bye.